Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Rico from the Made in China podcast, SourceFind Asia, and EnterChina.co. If you don't know what EnterChina is, you can check out the last episode. I talked about it a little bit more in depth, but real quick, we're going to be hosting a webinar for EnterChina. So if you go to enterchina.co/webinar, it should be September 23rd or 22nd, actually. It's going to be about how to find the right supplier, sort of stuff that we talk about. I'm actually going to break down the methods that I use in SourceFind Asia to find high quality suppliers. So that's that. So in this episode, I interviewed Neil Woodfine from Remitsy. He is the COO at the company. They're a startup, based in Beijing. They do cross-border payments through Bitcoin. So very interesting technology, very, very fascinating company, very smart guy. Neil's been doing business in China for a little while. He actually did sourcing back in the day and got into Bitcoin. So working for one of the largest Bitcoin exchanges, Bitcoin companies in China. And then eventually, he met his business partner and decided to make a go of it on his own. So I actually met him at the cross-border summit, like April this year, and we did the podcast in I'm pretty ashamed to admit it, but we did the podcast in like May or June, and it's just kind of been one of those things that I had, floating around, and I just didn't have time to get to it. But finally, ready to release it, and he just dropped a lot of knowledge bombs. We tried to not go too deep into the actual payment processing and stuff like that because, for a lot of people, maybe they're not even familiar with Bitcoin. So we talked about what Bitcoin is, what blockchain technology is, the way it can be applied, where we think it is right now, where we think it's going in the future. So we kind of touched on the beginner stuff and also a little bit of intermediate and advanced, but pretty much focused on his company and what they're doing and sort of his mindsets around doing business in China. So without further ado, enjoy the podcast.
I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me.
What motivates you more, money, legacy, technological innovation, or acquiring knowledge?
I think, as you're probably aware, Rico, that working at a startup, you're not exactly personally flush with cash. I think there's probably better ways to kind of make money in the short term, like having a stable career in a good industry. But I think when you're working at a startup, you need to be motivated more than money. Otherwise, I think it would be quite easy to lose focus. For me personally, I think the key thing is like an opportunity to make a big change in the way the world works. I think Bitcoin has come along, and blockchain too, and it's kind of allowed people to do things that they haven't been able to do before. It's allowing completely new businesses to be started. I think the finance industry, was something very difficult for startups to approach, but now with this kind of, technology, people can get in and do quite exciting things with very small teams. It's coming into starting Remitsy. I knew business payments were a problem from work that I'd done in the past, but I wouldn't exactly say I was passionate about it. It's just payments, right? But actually, after getting into the Remitsy project, I found that I've actually become increasingly passionate about it, and I think it's actually quite scary how bad some of the old systems are, and how much money is being lost by businesses every time they make a payment. I like to call it value leakage. If you imagine a kind of a water pipe, and every time the pipe is going from one person to another, you have quite a big hole where a lot of water is kind of escaping. I think that's a pretty good analogy for the way business payments work today. and this money is just going to middlemen that are essentially just moving money from one place to another. There's not really much value being added to the products or the services being provided. And at the end of the day, all of these fees, it's not really the businesses swallowing the costs. At the end of the day, it's the end customer picking up the tab. They're the ones that are buying the goods that are being manufactured, the services that are being rendered. And those extra costs that are brought into the system by banks and third-party payment providers, it's the consumer that's paying for that.
Yep. Yeah, we're definitely getting more into the payments part. I want to start at the beginning, though. So, simply put, for people who may not know, what is blockchain technology, specifically with Bitcoin?
So, I always feel a little bit apprehension when trying to answer this question, because I think it's a very complex answer. It's very difficult to kind of nail down. I think the best analogy is if you try to imagine explaining the internet to somebody that's never used it before, who'd never even heard of the concept, I think you would probably find it quite difficult. I think if you found 5 people and asked them to explain what the internet is, you would get 5 completely different answers. To some people, it might be a publishing platform. To others, it might be like a communication and messaging protocol. If you ask a developer, they may say it's an app development platform. So I think blockchain is actually quite similar in some respects. It can be a lot of different things to different people. I'm just going to describe it from my perspective. I think blockchain is just one component, really, of Bitcoin technology, and Bitcoin technology being first and foremost a digital currency. So the blockchain is the part of Bitcoin that basically packages up and records transactions for the network. And you can use this kind of transaction packaging and recording system separately, or you can use it in conjunction with a digital currency like Bitcoin. There's also other altcoins out there, which I'll probably not go into. But in my opinion, I think still the most exciting application of blockchain is Bitcoin, in particular because it's open and anybody can participate, whether they're kind of trying to mine Bitcoin or whether they're trying to just transact, whether they want to develop applications on the platform. Anybody can participate. Whereas I think at the moment there's quite a strong narrative coming out of kind of more established industries that the blockchain is actually the more exciting innovation. But unfortunately, I think that often is kind of people are trying to kind of make it a more kind of private, controllable platform rather than leaving it open like Bitcoin and the internet. Just trying to describe how a blockchain works, what it is. I think if you look at transactions in the past, any transaction that you made over the internet or through the banking system in the past, a ledger was kept centrally by a third party. So if you and me wanted to make a transaction, let's say I wanted to send you $100, a third party, probably the bank, would have to update their ledger to say $100 less in my account and $100 more in your account. What the blockchain does is it essentially allows it shares this ledger with everybody. So if I want to send, let's say, 1 Bitcoin to you, I update my ledger and then broadcast that update to the network. Then everybody, including you, and Bill and everybody else, updates their ledger to match mine. So we just completed a transaction now, minus 1 Bitcoin from my account, plus 1 Bitcoin to your account. And we didn't involve any other third parties. It was completely just between the two of us. And
that also acts as a safeguard, right? Like if I was trying to steal money and I try to make my ledger look like I have more money, if everybody else's ledger doesn't reflect mine, then it would be rejected, right? That transaction would be rejected.
Exactly. So everybody's handling and managing these ledgers, and everybody's checking each other's. So as soon as somebody starts behaving badly, they get discovered very quickly, and their ledger is ignored essentially from the network.
And just to clarify, this is not like people; this is computers. Everyone's personal. So when you say everyone's checking each other or everyone's ledger gets updated, that's an automatic process, right?
Yes. Sorry, I'm doing my best to try and simplify it here.
No, I'm pulling you along. Don't worry. But you've done a good job. I'm trying to think of like what if somebody doesn't know what you're talking about, what would the question be? Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, like just to center in on Bitcoin quickly, I think there's 4 properties for me that I think make Bitcoin really exciting. It's person to person, P2P. So as I just mentioned, we're able to transact now just between the two of us rather than involving any third parties. What that leads to is that you end up with a trustless system. It's actually not completely trustless. It's kind of trust minimized, but trustless is the label anyway. So now we no longer need to trust that the bank is holding our money. We no longer need to trust that the bank will deliver the money on time. We can rely on the network and know that the transaction will certainly go through. And another part of Bitcoin is that it has limited quantity. And I think a lot of people kind of struggle to understand why Bitcoin has value. But one of the kind of key components of that is the fact that the quantity is limited, and it always will be due to the way the kind of the technology's structured. And then also it's an open platform, as I just mentioned, which means that anybody can participate, anybody can buy a Bitcoin, anybody can transact, anybody can also build other platforms on top of it, much like the internet. Anybody can kind of publish a website, and anybody can kind of create apps on top of it.
I guess you've already touched on the main advantages. What are the disadvantages, and why did you specifically focus on Bitcoin? I know that there's other cryptocurrencies out there, so why did you focus on Bitcoin for your business?
So in terms of the disadvantages, I think everybody's quite aware of Bitcoin's volatility. So this is a really brand new tech. And it's still in its early stages of development. So that means there's still uncertainty about which direction the technology is going to go, what the technology is going to be able to do in the future, and also how it's going to be regulated. And I think also when you're trying to bootstrap a brand new currency, you can expect high amounts of volatility, and I think that'll continue for many years to come. So if you do want to use something like Bitcoin as a kind of transaction medium, you have to be very, very careful because the price can change minute to minute, hour to hour, which can, I think, put a lot of people off, and it limits its uses in business. And the next question was, why do we choose to use Bitcoin in our business? I think because at the moment there are other altcoins out there. I think the most prominent ones at the moment are probably Litecoin and Ethereum. But I think at the end of the day, Bitcoin is still the largest and most reliable, the most developed upon digital currency out there. And we think it offers the most reliability for the cross-border payments that we're working in.
Let's get to know you a little bit better. I'm sure a lot of listeners are wondering who's this Neil guy. We've previously spoken about how you actually used to do sourcing in your early days in China, and then you worked for OKCoin, which I think is the largest Bitcoin company in China. And can you talk a little bit about your background and how you got into Bitcoin and blockchain tech?
Yep, no probs. I studied Chinese at university in the UK, and pretty much immediately after graduating, I moved to China and got a job at a factory in Jiangsu, manufacturing fine dispersion machinery, and that was a bit of a kind of a baptism of fire in the manufacturing industry. I was working in a Sino-British joint venture, and I was essentially the kind of British representative, kind of looking after the kind of the manufacturing in the Chinese factory.
Yep.
So that was kind of my kind of entry into the world of Chinese manufacturing of factories, machinery, and that kind of set me off on this path where I worked on a lot of other kind of sourcing projects, and finally I was working for a cement machinery consultant in Nanjing. And while I was there, I basically a friend sent me an article on Bitcoin, and I had a bit of spare money left over, so I invested a little bit. And that was just before the huge run up in price at the end of 2013. So as the price was rising, I got quite excited and started researching about what this Bitcoin thing was, why the price was rising, why everybody was so excited about it. And by the time the price started crashing a couple of months later, I was already hooked. And despite the fact that the price was going down, I was kind of still completely convinced that this was going to be a really important technology in the future, and it was going to have quite a big effect on the way the finance world works. So I pretty much made a decision by that point that I had to do anything I could to get into the industry. So I kind of started looking at potential jobs that I could do, and the Chinese Bitcoin exchanges were all hiring international teams at the time. So I applied to OKCoin, which was the largest Bitcoin exchange in China at the time, which probably means it was the largest Bitcoin exchange in the world, and got a job doing business development on their international team.
Nice. I got into Bitcoin. I think it was 2012 or 2013, around the same time, just before the price crashed. It was just like I think I was on Business Insider, and then I came across an article about what's the name of that website? Silk Road, on the deep web. Do you know about the Silk Road?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Definitely. So yeah, definitely you have to, right? I was just fascinated. I was reading, and then they were talking about Bitcoin. I'm like, what's Bitcoin? And then just went down a rabbit hole from there. And I was just like preaching to all my friends about this new technology.
Excellent.
And going into your company setup, so your CEO is Richard Bensberg, and
that's right. Yeah.
And you had initial funding from John Porter, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
How did your team come together?
Yeah, so I was working at OKCoin, and while I was there, I met Richard, who was director of compliance, and we both had studied at Leeds University, which kind of gives us a bit of a connection. I think both of us had quite a similar point of view about Bitcoin and blockchain technology, and during that year that we worked there, we became quite good friends. Both of us later left for around the same time for different reasons, and started kind of each playing with some of our own ideas about what we could do with the knowledge that we got from our year at OKCoin. Richard began working on a cross-border project with John, looking at kind of improving the cross-border payment industry. And that kind of started to gain quite a bit of momentum. And then they invited me to join them and work together based on, because it was quite a good fit really with the the work that I'd done in the past with sourcing and manufacturing in China, these cross-border payments we kind of imagined them fitting into that industry.
Mm-hmm. And in a business like yours, how crucial was that initial capital?
I think starting a fintech company is quite different from starting any other type of startup. You're working with a much kind of greater regulatory burden, and it's very difficult to get going without an investment. In our early days, we were having to get licenses, open bank accounts, stuff like that. Also, Richard and I are not programmers, which is obviously quite a big barrier to entry when you're starting a startup. So we also need to hire developers to help us build out the technology. So that initial investment was pretty crucial, and it allowed us to get going straight away, rather than having to kind of create proofs of concept and go raising. It allowed us to kind of just hit the ground running and just get stuck in, basically.
So you guys are taking on more of the Steve Jobs type role, where you bring in a bunch of developers and tell them, I need this technology made right now.
Exactly, yeah.
Can you
sometimes
can you expand a little bit on your role as a CEO?
Yes. To be honest, I kind of sometimes feel a little bit embarrassed saying I'm a COO at a 7-person company. But, it's essentially just a title, and we're a small team. Everybody's handling different things. I think we're still in our super early stages, so we're still kind of working out who's specializing in what. But I think at the moment I've been most heavily involved in branding, marketing, and working a lot on business development. We all wear a lot of different hats, and it just kind of depends on what needs doing on which day.
Mm-hmm. I think what you guys are doing is pretty amazing. You know, I mean, I talked to you at the cross-border summit that we went to. I think it was like 3 weeks ago, and I mean, you told me about it, and immediately I was sold. Can you talk a little bit about what Remitsy is exactly, and how does it work?
Okay, so I mean, despite the fact that we're a company that uses Bitcoin, I don't like to kind of think of us as a Bitcoin or a blockchain company. We're essentially just a cross-border payments company that helps businesses outside of China make payments into China. And what we're essentially doing is we're connecting the domestic banking networks and cutting out the international banking networks, which are quite slow and old, whereas the domestic banking networks are actually pretty fast. They're cheap. They work quite efficiently. And that's the same whether you're in the UK, whether you're in Germany, whether you're in China. The domestic banking networks are great. So we essentially allow a British company to make a payment within the UK. Then we basically convert the pounds into renminbi and deliver the renminbi within a domestic banking network in China. And the way we do the conversion and the cross-border part is by basically using Bitcoin in the middle as a kind of conversion medium between the pounds and the renminbi.
And that cuts down on time. It cuts down on the fees. Break down the fees a little bit.
Yeah. So through the traditional system, you're essentially going through many different third parties. If let's say a traditional bank payment from the UK would start with the bank in the UK, and then it would go through the SWIFT network. And the SWIFT network is basically a string of connected correspondent banks. And each one of those middlemen, each one of those third parties needs to take a cut to kind of pay for their operating costs. And these fees can mount up. Essentially what you see as an end user is a send fee at the send end, and then a receive fee at the recipient end. And then also, when the currencies are being converted, you're also seeing, quite a lot of, exchange rate losses there too. So, I think whatever exchange rate a bank provides to you, is not the, what we call the real exchange rate, which is the mid-market rate. Generally, it also includes a little bit of commission for them too. So we think it's really important that everybody is aware of this mid-market rate and is aware that any exchange rate that they get that's different from that means that they're paying another fee. So Goldman Sachs have estimated that the average cost of making a bank transfer is around 6%. I don't think that's necessarily true for payments to China, but certainly across the world, on average, businesses are losing about 6% every time they make a transaction.
Yeah, and it's more with PayPal.
So with so originally we kind of imagined ourselves competing solely with the banks, but as we've kind of developed, we've realized that there's still many businesses using services like PayPal under the third-party payment providers for their transactions, and the fees through these third-party payment providers are really quite high. You have processing fees, you have really bad exchange rates, and then also usually at the recipient's end, there's another fee for withdrawals or other processing costs. So I mean, they can get quite high. We estimate that on average a PayPal transaction from sender to recipient costs between 6 and 9%, and that it's really important to kind of point out that when we're talking about the costs of the transaction, we're not just talking about the costs to the sender or to the recipient. We think it's important to view the payment holistically. You have to kind of understand that your recipient's fees are also your fees too. These fees add up, and they kind of they add to the cost of the transaction. So if you can reduce those fees for the recipient, technically you should also be able to reduce the cost of the goods or the services that you're purchasing.
It complicates things because when I send out an invoice, I don't even know exactly how much money I'm actually going to receive most of the time. I'm like guessing. So if I quote somebody $1,000 for whatever service, and then I'll take into consideration, how much is the bank transfer fee, and then I'll add that to the invoice. But then, sometimes it's $40, sometimes it's $45, sometimes it fluctuates depending on the bank. So then I have to adjust that in my books, and it's just a nightmare. So having a situation like this where kind of exactly how much you're going to receive is so good for the receiver as well. And like you said, you can reduce the costs for the buyer. Are they?
I mean, just to kind of also make a point on that. I think that's another problem with the old way of doing business in this sector. Fees have been hidden fees are hidden by banks. Fees are hidden by the third-party payment providers. And I think in the future you're going to see that some of these new players that are coming in, whether they're using Bitcoin or not, the newer fintech players recognize that people that are using these systems are sick of not being able to predict their costs. And we think it's really important for the costs of these payments to become much more transparent. So it's important to kind of point out the mid-market rate, and it's important to kind of make it clear to the customer exactly how much they're paying to make their transaction.
Are there limitations on the amount of money one can transfer in a day with your service?
So with Remitsy, we have a limitation of $100,000 per day per customer. We don't have many. Basically, we specialize really in small business payments, so we don't have many customers hitting that limit. But that's our limit for now.
And then who qualifies for this service? Like, what kind of, if I want to register with Remitsy, what do I have to do to be qualified?
So it just essentially you just need to be a registered business, and you need to be making business related transactions. As long as you meet those two criteria, anybody can use our service.
I think we talked about this before. It's just like proving that would just be maybe showing your business license and then also showing an invoice, right?
So when we've tried to make the registration process as fast as possible. You can actually register in less than 5 minutes, quite happily. So when you input those details, let's say your company name, we can actually go and check public record information to find out the rest of the information we require on your company, and then also. No, that's about it. Sorry. Yeah. And
then is there any more cost besides the fee that you take off of the transactions?
Joining, setting up an account is certainly free. And the only fee that we take is the 1 to 2.5% on the send amount that you're sending to your recipient.
So you've touched on the old banking system. Can you talk a little bit? I like the way you explain you compare the SWIFT network to what you're doing right now. Can you talk a little bit about how convoluted that system is?
I think I've already touched on it already. But I mean, the SWIFT network was set up in the early 70s, I think 1973. So that was a long time before even the internet. And really, it's just not kind of cut out for the internet age. It's basically a long, like I mentioned earlier, a long string of correspondent banks, and you have a lot of kind of manual hands-on work at those banks to kind of transmit these payments to the next step in the process. I think, for example, just recently there was a big scandal about the Bangladeshi SWIFT network getting hacked, and that was just a case of the hackers basically tricking a HP printer into printing out the wrong recipient details. That shouldn't be able to happen in this kind of digital age that we live in, I think. And I think it's time now for some more kind of modern international transaction networks to be set up.
Yeah, and it's like when you send a payment, you said there's multiple banks communicating, so it's like my bank will tell another bank that I've sent payment, and then somebody has to physically reflect that, right? There has to be like a person who does that.
Exactly, and it's also just a messaging system. So not only do you have like a lot of kind of real people having to interact with the system and paper to be handed over from one person to the next, it's also just a one-way message. So let's say a problem occurs with a payment, either it gets lost or one of the kind of the digits in the address is wrong, so it can't be delivered. It's very, very difficult to find out the status of that payment within the SWIFT network. What essentially you have to do is send another message through the system to follow it up, to find out what the problem is. And that can often require a phone call. Basically, it's a very difficult problem to resolve.
And okay, so the SWIFT network is outdated and things like that. But then, interestingly, I remember you talking about banks, and you said you actually want the banks to continue to operate. And to me, and I guess to other people, it would sound like your business is going to put banking out of business. But are you worried at all in the future of banks putting pressure on a business like yours, or not wanting to cooperate with your company?
So payments are just a small part of the of bank's business. So I think if we disrupt payments, we're not really disrupting the banks. Also, I think our system is heavily reliant on banks. Actually, as I mentioned earlier, we're actually just kind of cutting out the international banking network rather than the domestic banking network. we actually think the domestic banking networks are pretty great. In China, in the UK especially, both of them are very fast and very cheap. So we need them to be in business to be able to complete our payments and hold our clients' funds.
And some banks are beginning to be interested in adopting blockchain technology, right?
Banks are also, yes, very kind of keen to explore Bitcoin and blockchain technology. I think almost every single large bank at the moment has a blockchain laboratory where they're kind of running quite a few experiments. I think even organizations like Swift are looking into how it can be used to optimize their payment systems. So yeah, I think banks are also going to try and fight back against these kind of smaller fintech players, which are perhaps delivering things like payments in a kind of more efficient and cheaper way.
Or if they're smart, they'll invest in you guys or maybe want to start a partnership, you know?
Well, I mean, that would be awesome. Yeah. But yeah, let's see how things play out.
All right. A lot of people are skeptical of Bitcoin. I never was because I was excited about it. But when I used to talk to my friends about it, you know, there was always these news stories. You know, Bitcoin Bank gets hacked, or Bitcoin Exchange loses millions of dollars. I remember Mount Gox, yeah. Back in 2014, I think they lost what was like 850,000 Bitcoin, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And then, of course, we talked a little bit about like things like Silk Road and, you know, the dark web. Like, what are the biggest misconceptions people have about cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in particular?
I think a lot of people associate it with crime and, like you say, kind of hacks. But I think a lot of that is fueled by the media, who kind of like sensational stories. And I think what kind of gets missed a lot is all of the development work that's kind of going on in the background quietly. There's a lot of very exciting applications being developed out there, which I think people are not really being exposed to. And I think another kind of common misconception is just saying Bitcoin as a kind of digital currency only, or a speculative asset. Actually, Bitcoin represents a lot more than that. And it has many applications outside of just kind of this kind of transmittance of a currency. You can also, for example, kind of record assets on the blockchain and use that to you can then transact your assets without third parties. So, for example, you could put deeds to your house on the blockchain, and then if I want to sell my house to you, I would literally just send this token that represents my house to you, and we no longer have to go through kind of housing registries or estate agents, that kind of thing. And then there's also so many applications in things like smart contracts. So we could execute a contract between one another automatically without requiring lawyers or third parties. There's identity applications. So there's all sorts of these kind of new services and new applications that can be built on top of the network that people still haven't really even begun to imagine.
Mm-hmm. What would you recommend if I was like first time hearing about Bitcoin and I want to just understand? Where should I start? Is there a book? Is there a blog? Like, is there a podcast?
I just recently read a book called Digital Gold, and I think that's a great kind of way to hear the crazy story about the kind of early beginnings of Bitcoin. I think anybody that reads that book can't help but be a little bit excited about the potential of Bitcoin. And then I think the probably strongest Bitcoin kind of community site is probably Reddit. The Reddit Bitcoin thread is probably a great place to get started in kind of picking up the latest news and kind of people's views on where the technology is going and and strange stuff that's happening on any day in Bitcoin. In terms of other resources, I can send you after the podcast, and maybe you can add them in the summary.
Yeah, I'll put them in the show notes on our website. Let's talk a little bit about Bitcoin exchanges. I think something that I found confusing, and when I first heard about it and stuff, is that they work independently, or they operate sort of independently from each other. So because Canada is smaller, the price of Bitcoin there might be different from the price of Bitcoin in China. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think this kind of concept works outside of Bitcoin. So if you have an exchange in Canada, a traditional exchange in Canada and a traditional exchange in the UK, for example, they will have different prices for from the Canadian dollar to the pound currency pair. So I think essentially you have a certain number of traders on a Canadian exchange, a certain number of traders on the Chinese exchange, and a certain number of traders on the UK exchange. And these are separate entities most of the time. And all of them have a different kind of view on how valuable Bitcoin is. But what you'll find is that if, for example, the traders in China decide that Bitcoin is worth slightly more and they start pushing up the price, people outside of China on the UK exchanges or the Canadian exchanges will start to purchase Bitcoins at the lower price and then sell the Bitcoins on the Chinese exchange at the higher price. What that does is it creates sell pressure on the Chinese exchange, and it creates buy pressure on the exchanges outside of China, which leads to the prices generally settling at a very similar amount. And that's happening all the time across all the exchanges. So what you end up with is a very similar price in equivalent terms across all exchanges across the world.
All right. That was succinct. What was one of your earliest failures or difficulties as a fintech startup in mainland China, and how did you overcome them?
So I think specifically as a foreign company getting started in China, registration can sometimes be a bit of a pain point. But we were quite fortunate to hear about the Qianhai Free Trade Zone, which is to the west of Shenzhen. And they, at the time, were offering some pretty good preferential policies for WFIs, foreign companies, to get registered. And we found a great agent there that allowed us to get registered very, very quickly, within 2 months, and at quite low cost. And also, I think in many other jurisdictions, getting registered as a internet finance company can be quite difficult, whereas in Qianhai, they're actually encouraging internet finance companies to get registered there, although I do believe that's changed just recently.
What's something that you wish you spent less time on when starting out?
I think developing the product to such an extent as we did. I read quite a lot of startup literature, and they're always talking about the kind of the lean startup, the lean launch, and trying to get your product on the market as quickly as possible. And despite knowing that, I think we still spent too long in developing a lot of features that users don't use and don't need, and that costs time, that costs money, and it takes away time that we could have spent after releasing the product on developing things that I think are more useful for our users. So I think if I could go back to our early days, I would definitely spend less time in planning exactly how the product is going to look and exactly how the product is going to work, and adding all the bells and whistles that we thought were essential but turned out to not really be particularly useful.
Yeah, the lean startup model talks about getting your MVP out and then adjusting to the user's needs, right, and feedback.
Yeah, but I think as well, when you're running a financial company, there's only so far you can take that concept. You still have to ensure that your platform is entirely secure. And I think it also requires a certain kind of extra level of shine and polish compared to perhaps other domains. If you're starting a social network, for example, I don't think you need to kind of have. I don't think in the early days you need to present as much professionalism as when dealing with business to business payments.
What is your proudest entrepreneurial moment to date?
Remitsy, for sure. I think it's totally awesome that now with blockchain technology, 7 guys can put together a company that allows businesses to convert currencies and make payments across borders. Prior to blockchain technology, it required very large institutions, very large companies, thousands of people to kind of complete these transactions. It would take 3 to 5 working days as standard, whereas now our very, very small team is completing cross-border payments faster and cheaper than these much older, much larger organizations.
And how are you currently attracting new users, and how do you plan to scale Remitsy? Like, I'm assuming networking has been essential. Right? That's how we met, right? How do you plan on scaling?
I think with a business to business model, there's a limit to how fast you can scale. If you're working in the consumer market, I think it's kind of you can work on a model where you build it and they'll come. Whereas I think in business to business, a lot of the kind of development comes from relationships and and building those up. So we're quite happy to kind of scale slow and steady at the moment. We're onboarding users every week, and I think we're not kind of aiming to become a $1 billion unicorn in a year or 2 years. We're just happy to kind of basically grow the company as steadily and sustainably as possible.
I guess you don't have a ton of competitors, but one of my friends actually works for one of your competitors, but they're focused on the Latin American market and Spanish-speaking buyers. How do you guys see yourself in your arena? How do you guys differentiate yourselves from your competition?
What we've done differently to many other payments startups, Bitcoin or not, is that we focused purely on one channel, that's inbound payments into China. And I think that's kind of played to our own kind of experience and expertise. Between Richard and I, we've got over 25 years of experience working in and with China. And I think when you kind of focus down on just one channel like this, you can really kind of optimize your payment system. So we can deliver payments cheaper and faster than perhaps a company that's kind of trying to facilitate payments from any country to any other country. And also it allows us to focus our business development, allows us to focus our marketing. And I think that's really where our strength lies.
All right, so we're getting more into the closing personal questions. What is your personal vision for Remitsy? Like, where do you see the company in 3 to 5 years, and then in 10 years?
So I think this kind of relates to where I see the payments market going. And this is just my own personal view. I think payments are going to get commodified, and I think they're going to get commodified pretty quickly. I think with the advent of Bitcoin and blockchain technology, payments is definitely getting cheaper, and it's forced, like we discussed earlier, the banks and the payment networks to kind of start kind of really kicking into gear and improving their own systems. You also have other innovative fintech companies like TransferWise reducing the cost of payments, and I think we're going to get we're going to see the cost of payments going closer and closer to zero. And for that matter, exchanging currencies too, I think is going to get cheaper also. So if you're just purely a payments company, I think that's going to be really dangerous in the future, because your revenue stream is going to get smaller, and the space is going to get more competitive. So I think we just see payments as something that needs to get solved now. We're certainly significantly more competitive than existing solutions, but I think that kind of edge will kind of start to fade in 3 to 5, maybe 10 years. Mm-hmm. So we want to use this kind of in the long term, this payments platform that we've built, to start adding a number of other value-added services on top. So, for example, small companies right now don't really have access to trade finance products, things like letters of credit. These things are normally kind of only the domain of very, very large companies, and even very large companies often try to avoid them due to the costs involved. But the beauty of Bitcoin and blockchain technology is that you don't really need third parties in, for example, an escrow situation, and it also allows you to automate the process, so you don't need as much hands-on work, and that would allow us to provide escrow services at a much lower cost, and open up escrow services to small businesses, which I think would be really attractive and would help them limit their risk when purchasing products and services from places like China and elsewhere in the world. And then also, I think there's also many other problems throughout the supply chain for companies that Bitcoin and blockchain can help serve. And I think going further forward, we'd like to explore how we could help with those too, using payment rails as kind of the starting point.
Smallest thing you've done that's brought you the largest results?
Smallest thing that we've done that's give us the most results. I think engaging online with communities of people, creating content has been our best method for kind of bringing in users. We've recently been kind of engaging on platforms like Quora and Reddit, and that has really kind of done very well for us. I think it kind of positions us it kind of allows us to show that we're kind of in a position of authority on the subject, and it's where people go to find out answers to their questions these days. And I think compared to kind of more direct business development model, it's probably more efficient.
Top 3 apps you use every day?
Top 3 apps. Let me look at my iPhone. I think certainly for our team, Slack is key. We also use Asana to kind of track the tasks that we're all handling.
I'm seeing a lot of synergy here.
And then also for development, I'm a big fan of Blossom, which is kind of my kind of probably less well-known one.
What's Blossom?
Blossom.io. It's essentially a development management app based on a Kanban board. So if you've ever used Trello, it's quite similar to that, but purely focused on web development. And that's a group because our developers actually work from London, so that for us it's a great tool to kind of help us coordinate the development of our platform.
Okay. And last question, do you have any general advice for fintech entrepreneurs out there that might be interested in the Asian market, or specifically, I guess, China?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand that in the consumer space, Alipay and WeChat dominate, and that if you're planning on doing any kind of fintech work in the consumer space, you're going to be competing with them, and that's going to be really difficult. I think for any kind of entrepreneurs or startups trying to enter the Chinese market, you also have to be aware that competition can be really fierce and can actually get pretty nasty over here. And Chinese startups can often be a lot better funded and can throw money at the problem longer than you can. So that's another kind of risk to watch out for. But then I think in the business space, there's not actually many solutions over here. People are still using the traditional kind of big four banks, and their services, I think, are kind of not great and not very efficient. So I think anybody that can help solve financial problems for businesses over here, maybe could have a better shot than in the consumer space.
Hey Neil, man, I think this was a great episode. Like a lot of new information. I tried not to make it too dense and keep it somewhat light. But thanks for being on the podcast. If people want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
So also thanks, Rico. Really great to be on your show. If people want to get in touch, they can send me an email at n@remitsy.com. I'm also on Twitter at nwoodfine. And we also have a live chat app on our website. So if you message me on there, I'll probably pick up, as long as it's China working hours.
All right, guys, and if you want to reach out to us and you want to find all the information that Neil talked about on our website, that's sourcefineasia.com/made in China and info@sourcefineasia.com, and as well Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, SourceFineAsia. Thank you.